Welcome to Politics and Tactics. We got a great show for you tonight. Want to thank Mark Ha for being behind the scenes and making all this happen, and also changing our beginning to something that's tolerable. So we really appreciate Mark's effort. I'm here with PJ. We got a special guest, and PJ is going to introduce our guest for us tonight. PJ.
Thanks, Frank. And as always, thanks for the opportunity to co-host a show with you. So today we have a great show. We have Daniel DeYear, who's originally from the Bronx. Unfortunately, he's not a New York Yankee fan, but he's still a great guest, and we're looking forward to chatting with him tonight. He's a 45-year veteran of the fire service, beginning in the Northeast, Rhode Island. He served the past 32 years with the Dallas Fire Department, where he recently retired as deputy chief. He's also spent nearly 10 years with the Carrollton, Texas Fire Department, and he was an international fire marshal for the U.S. Department of State. And that's a pretty cool resume. It's a 45 years international fire marshal. We definitely have a few things to talk about tonight. So, Chief, thanks for taking your time to speak with us and tell us a little about yourself and your tenure in the fire service, and help impart some education and knowledge on us tonight and all of our listeners. So thank you so much. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Daniel and I met at a dinner Mike Galliano puts together every year. He invites different people every year. So one year I happened to get invited with Daniel. Interesting cast of characters, everybody from a little bit different backgrounds, but it was a great dinner. And right then and there at that dinner, I was like, Mike, why isn't he teaching at FDIC? I mean, here's a guy with so many years experience working in Dallas. I mean, Dallas is a respected large city department, but it's a department that you don't hear a lot about on the circuit. You hear a lot about Houston, you hear a lot about El Paso, but Daniel, why do you think you don't hear as much about Dallas? Like they need a marketing team, I think.
Well, perhaps they do. Although recently we've had a host of chief officers who've left the Dallas Fire Department to take head of department chief jobs across the country. But I think we went probably 25 or 30 years with nobody leaving the Dallas Fire Department. And we went a considerable period of time early in my career with the same chief of the department and no outside influence. So Dallas has never really ventured outside of its own walls over most of my career.
Now, PJ being the director of a fire academy, he's looking at things from an administrative level that are beyond a lot of individuals. And when we were talking at dinner, you were explaining how you had some background in line of duty death investigations. Can you kind of expand upon that?
Sure. Well, during my career with the Dallas Fire Department, we lost 21 firefighters to line of duty deaths. Now, a significant number of those have been attributed to the cancers. We had one COVID death, and certainly most of them were heart attacks and illness related. But we did have a handful of tactical fire ground deaths. And then in 2013, I had become the deputy chief of the training division. And because of that position, I ended up on the state fire marshal's line of duty death task force for the state of Texas in 2013. And just to refresh everybody's memory, we didn't get too far into the year. Bryan, Texas lost 2 firefighters in the Knights of Columbus Hall fire, a big box fire. A month later 2 months later in West Texas, we had the catastrophic explosion that killed a dozen first responders, including a captain with the Dallas Fire Department who lived in West and was a good friend of mine. On May 20th, the anniversary just passed this week already. May 20th of 2013, we lost Stanley Wilson in the Dallas Fire Department in a building collapse. And then on May 31st of 2013, Houston lost 5 firefighters to the Southwest End fire. And so what happened for me, I ended up with 19 line of duty deaths in a 144-day period of time. And I was involved in all of those investigations. My name is on those reports. And I kind of got indoctrinated into the world, unfortunately, to the club of our fire service that nobody wants to be a member of.
Chief, so Chief, as a deputy chief, what was your role? Obviously, you took on a huge role with these line of duty death investigations, but what was your actual real role, your Monday through Friday, or your 365 role? Because obviously that was probably an additional topic that you had to deal with.
So what was my role in my job in the Dallas Fire Department or in the LODD task force?
As deputy chief in the fire department.
So I oversaw the training division, which basically included our recruit training as well as our in-service training. and oversaw and worked with the special operations group for any training. We have a significant facility at 5,000 Dolphin Road in Dallas, which is our training facility. So we have a 40-acre site with burn buildings and high-rise towers and driving course and classrooms, and we conduct all of our own training in the Dallas Fire Department through the recruit process. So I was responsible for all of that as well as the recruiting.
So you were intimate with your membership, even though a large department. You know, the training division is that division who always knows everybody in the department and knows all the shifts. So to have that additional task on the line of duty task force had to be a significant challenge that impacted you, but also gave you the ability to bring that back to training and use it to honor those lost and have a positive impact on the department.
Absolutely correct.
Did you see a theme throughout the tactical firefighter line of duty deaths?
I did. The biggest theme that I saw was the quickness of which almost all of them occurred. Almost every one of them occurred clearly within the first 15 minutes of the incident. Matter of fact, I want to say somewhere around the 7 to 8 minute mark was the typical time frame of the company or the individual who had been on scene. So within less than 10 minutes of their arrival at the scene of the incident, they were killed in the fire, unfortunately. So there was that theme. And then looking more deeply, because it's really, it was eye-opening for me, because you don't want to play Monday morning quarterback and question anybody else's tactics. And we can so easily see some things that make our skin crawl or make us ask why they would have chosen to do that. But in the reality, nobody needs to read a report that says, you know, that somebody made a mistake or somebody chose to do the wrong thing accidentally and it cost somebody their life or their own life. So those reports tend to be a little bit vanilla, if you would. But what I wanted to see a little bit more of was the come to Jesus meetings that most fire departments have to have behind closed doors that really do address what were the factors that contributed to the death and what we can learn from that to try to avoid having that happen again. And one of my concerns was in some departments, you know, they didn't even want to acknowledge that anything had happened at all that was incorrect, which is alarming for me because it's easy to make that mistake again. Now we learned nothing from the incident whatsoever. Also, what I came to learn and realize is all the questions that I had originally asked myself or I had seen previous investigators ask in line of duty deaths wasn't so much what were they thinking or why did they choose to do that, but the question is, why did they make that choice at the time they made the choice? Because it's not fair for us. Every investigation I went to, I already knew how the fire turned out before I even began participating in the investigation. So I know it ends poorly. Well, they never had that information. And every one of us that are in the fire service, we all know we don't have every piece of information at every incident to make every single decision 100% of the time accurately. And I think the question that really needs to be looked at a little bit more deeply is why did they choose to make the decisions that they did at that moment? And I really haven't seen a lot of work put into that over the years. I do discuss it in some of my presentations, but I think that's one of the lingering questions that really it doesn't resonate with everybody in the fire service because everybody's too worried that we're trying to assess blame. And that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to figure out, you know, if I'd been in the same shoes, could I have easily made the same decision, even knowing how the incident turned out, based on the information that I had leading up to that moment? And that's where culture came in. So that was some of the things that I had seen in the investigations over the years, unfortunately.
You know, Chief, one of the things that always just frustrates me, and one of our good friends clued me into this many years ago, Chris Pepler, you know, talking about the NIOSH line of duty deaths and their reporting. And while I completely understand why NIOSH does what they do, but they allow the report to be redacted before it hits the public, right? They give the department, you know, the town managers, the chief, the mayor, whoever it is, the ability to redact certain things from those reports to kind of save face with the American Fire Service and not to make the department look bad, which I personally do not agree with. You know, while I understand it, I don't agree with it because when we read NIOSH line of duty death reports, most of the firefighters I talk to think that those reports are 100% factual, include all the details of the incident, but we know that it actually doesn't. During your investigations, how did you handle that?
Well, unfortunately, that's the political process it has to go through. The Texas State Fire Marshal's Office kind of operates the same way as NIOSH does. In other words, the fire department gets to edit and redact, add, delete anything they want to add to the report. And once again, knowing that the reports could possibly be read by somebody who's questioning why their spouse is no longer coming home or why their mom or dad is no longer coming home. We don't want a family member to read something that could cast a shadow or a light on somebody else in a negative manner. Because once again, we don't always know what was going through their mind when some of those decisions were made. But I wish there was some way that we could have some sort of closed shop report where we could be as truthful and honest and call it as it actually is and say, this is where the decision was made that could have been better, or this is what was done prior to the incident, lack of knowledge of fire science or building construction or familiarity with the building. All of those things, at some point, like I said, I think there should be that come to Jesus meeting within that organization where they close the door and no media is allowed, no recordings allowed, and we can have a heart-to-heart conversation and say, now how do we move forward? And besides all of those line of duty deaths in such a short period of time, one of them was the Dallas Fire Department. And in that particular fire incident, I was not the investigator with the State Fire Marshal's Office. I had to revert to my duties as the deputy chief of the training division, and I was solely in charge of the investigation for the Dallas fire death. So, and there was a lot of contentious issues that surrounded that. And it became sort of a political nightmare in the media, if you would. There were a lot of accusations that were thrown back and forth, a lot of suppositions, and it became very, very ugly. Ultimately, when the report was finished, there was a handful of suggestions that were made that were very watered down. But even to this day, a significant portion of those recommendations never came to fruition. It's kind of like we just let it go long enough and it finally went away and we moved on to something else. But where my concern is, having had a training background and then having seen what happened up close, I'm more concerned of us repeating something that could so easily be fixed by learning the hard lessons.
I think what you said is going to actually come as a surprise to a lot of our listeners that, a redaction is one thing because that could be argued with to come to light through a subpoena or through the freedom of information or sunshine laws that we have. But this is really, if they can edit it, it's really a affront to good governance and transparency. And it really does a disservice to the fire service and the public at large. Now, I could see that we want to be sensitive about a certain individual. And I think what you said is brilliant, that we know how the fire ended up at the end. So I think that's great that you put it through the lens that the investigation should be done based off the information that that individual is believed to have at that time. Because we all know, as first due company officers, firefighters and officers and chiefs, they're trying to make perfect decisions based off imperfect information. But to have a report come in and to have this appearance of, hey, the feds are here or the Texas fire marshal's here, and we're going to get this conclusive report. I don't think the public realizes that these reports can be edited beforehand. Now, I do, after hearing what you said, I think there's got to be some measures in the reporting system, some process. In other words, kind of like a promotional exam. You walk into a promotional exam, good promotional exams have consensus. One person can't tank the whole interview. They got to come to a consensus before they give you the score. Maybe borrowing some of that process of having a consensus amongst the investigators. Because my question to you is, I used to work in New Haven, and if you interviewed everybody after every job we had, you would have thought we went to 4 different fires. So, what was your experience with that when interviewing people, that sometimes individuals' perspectives when they're being interviewed is so far off? So with that, I think there is some merit to have a process with consensus to make sure things are documented correctly, and some erroneous information may be footnoted as erroneous, but to leave it completely out to just protect somebody's ego really is an affront. And I think Alan Brunacini did it best when those firefighters were killed in that toluene attack. that when they were cutting the toluene tank, he put it out for the world to say, hey, learn from this. And I think you're coming at this through the same lens of Alan Brunacini to say, hey, we're not here to lay blame. We just want to do better. Can you speak to that? I think I gave you like 4 questions there. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm not sure where to start. I should have been writing all that down as you were asking me. So to one of the points that you made, the Stan Wilson line of duty death, it was really difficult. It was a very lengthy process because unfortunately he died almost 3 hours into a defensive fire. And then it took another 3 hours for him to be recovered. So we had a timeline that basically spanned a almost 8 hour period of time, actually, from the beginning to the end. And by that time we had a shift change. We had basically about 400 people who had some sort of an involvement in the incident that had to be interviewed. Whereas the Southwest End fire in Houston that resulted in 5 deaths, the entire process, the entire incident only lasted about 11 minutes before the building collapsed. So when you took out the people, I apologize for the phone ringing there. I should have turned that off before.
That just means you're important. It's okay.
Well, it's always on silent. I don't know how I did that. But so the question to ask in some of these investigations is, where was everybody at the time the incident occurred? And in Dallas, we for years have used a packet of information that basically asks, what was your assignment? Where were you? What did you hear, see, smell, taste? And at the end, you're supposed to flip it over on the back and draw a diagram of the incident. Well, at the Stanley Wilson fire, there were 3 buildings that were all tied together, but the middle building that kind of formed the perpendicular part of the T was where the fire was. What was interesting in looking at everybody's drawings is almost everybody drew an L, either a backwards L or a forwards L, because based on where they were on the fire, they never saw the other side of the incident. They never saw the flip side of the building. So it told me right off the bat that the lens that they were looking through was not even half the incident. They were only looking at a small portion of it. And then to your credit, when you were asking about their statements, I had a couple of engine crews and truck crews that I talked to that I finally had to sit them down at a table with a map and take their statements and say, were you even at the same incident? I mean, you're referring to different floors. You're referring to left versus right. Well, and the reality is none of them were oriented to the same direction in the interview. A lot of them said, we searched the apartments on the left, and somebody else from the same company said we were searching the apartments on the right. They never went across the hall. Well, how did that happen? Well, once you put them down at the table, we had to orient it, and turned out to be everybody was talking about the same direction. They were just looking at it from different ends of the hallway. So it was simple statements like that, but it was very time consuming because you'd go back to circle in with the crew and find out, hey, explain this for me. But 3 of the members were off that day that I was trying to get back to the fire station. So trying to catch them all at the same firehouse, some of them had been hired back, some of them had swung in, some of them were subbing for other individuals. It was just a challenge to get everybody on the same page. In the Houston incident, we really had less than 30 individuals that we were interviewing because unfortunately 5 had been killed and 4 others were in ICU. And that was at the moment of the collapse. So while hundreds of more firefighters showed up, all of that happened after the actual incident occurred. So we really had a very small pool of people to interview. And then you take their statements and you read through their statements, but you had to bring them in. And it was to clarify, because there's a lot of them would say, I didn't see anything. I was on the pump panel on the opposite side of the engine. I didn't know anything. I didn't know where anybody was until I heard the Mayday. So they just wrote a few sentences, but others had written a few paragraphs because they were right there with everybody when the collapse occurred. But their statements would say, we stretched a cross lay off the engine and took it through the east door. Well, when you get to doing the actual investigation and you're trying to define, who gave you the order? Was it face-to-face? Was it on the radio? Which engine did you pull the line off of? Which line did you actually pull? And then show me on the map which of the east doors you went through. And now you're having to answer, you're actually having to dig into it a lot deeper, even though they gave a good, concise explanation of their involvement. As from an investigative point of view, you had to ask repeated questions, unfortunately. And it was hard because in Houston, which I was not prepared for, the fire in Houston occurred on a Friday. I happen to have been, I serve on the Texas Commission on Fire Protection. I'm the chair of the advisory committee. And we had a meeting that day, and I was on my way back to Dallas, and I got a phone call from the former fire chief in Galveston, Mike Wisco. who told me that they were missing 9 people in a fire in Houston and they had confirmed fatalities. So I knew I was going to end up down there. So I finished my drive home, changed my clothes, grabbed my stuff, and headed to Houston, and got down there by 10 o'clock that evening. And I was given that book that had all of the statements from everybody that was at the fire. They had already amassed all of that information. And I was told that we would start interviewing them the following morning at 9 o'clock. And I wasn't prepared for that, because these guys, it hadn't even been 24 hours since their brothers and sisters had died in that fire. I'm an outside member. I'm not a Houston firefighter. I'm a Dallas firefighter. And then I'm having to ask them to explain their answers and their actions, which was, very trying and very difficult, very emotional, not just for them, but for me as well. Now, you had a couple of other questions in there, and I'm not sure I answered them. So I'm okay if you want to re-ask.
I'll go to PJ and then I'll come back.
Okay.
That means he was hoping that you wrote them down so you'd remember them, because I didn't remember them. It's interesting that you mentioned Houston. Houston has had a really unfortunate run of multiple, line of duty deaths. I just brought the list up. 2010 and 11 and 12, they had no line of duty deaths. But since then, they've had 2 and 13, 1 and 14, 2 and 15, and 1 and 16. So they had a bad stretch there. That was Houston only. And you're familiar with Connecticut. We're a very small state, so there's very few line of duty deaths here. But now you look at one department in the city of Houston, they've had a bad run. You look all the way back to 2000. I'm going to say 20, just off the top, not counting each one. So my counting could be completely off. That's a lot of line of duty deaths for one department or one agency. And I see here some were NIOSH investigations and some were state fire marshal reports. So you definitely have had your fill of investigations. And you said just in your department alone, 21. That's a lot. What do you take out of all of those investigations that if you had the 5 things, we're familiar with like the NIOSH 5, what would you say, or what is your class that you're looking to teach at FDIC who is related to this speak about regarding those 5 things that you would want a recruit firefighter or a first line company officer to know? What are those points that you want them to be aware of so they don't repeat history?
Right. Well, I think it's the same information that we hear from everybody, is the fact that training, and absolutely education, not just checking boxes, but information that's shared, learned, and can be applied in the future as we move forward. I obviously understanding fire science a lot better than we do, which we clearly do in my 45-year career, and then the building construction concerns. So I see a lot of departments that had used tactics that they probably shouldn't have used. In other words, they didn't bring enough GPNs to the BTUs to even attempt to ever win the fight for the fire. But the heart and soul of the firefighters are there. And one of the things to credit the Houston Fire Department with, which is very similar to Dallas, is there are very, very good firefighters with a lot of passion. If God forbid, if your family or your kids are still in a building, those are departments that you want to have come get your kids. They've got that heart, they've got that passion, they've got that dedication of service. And that's great. And a lot of times in my presentations for years, I kind of talked about the safety aspect, and then I talk about we took an oath and we're their last hope, and the question of, are we number 1 or number 2? And I would give my presentation and I would really never take a stance. I knew what my stance was, but I wouldn't share it with anybody else. And then they would ask me afterwards, well, which side of the fence are you on? Are we safety, or are we their last chance? And every abandoned building that's boarded up that we're prying plywood off of, there could be homeless people in there. We're going to go in there and save them. I didn't take the stance, but I can tell you what it is. I've started to actually share it now in most of my presentations for the last 5 years, is the fact that I want Mad Dog, tough, are willing to do whatever it takes to get those people if they're still in that building. I have to have those people. I have to have the consummate perfectionist firefighter. In other words, they showed up ready to go to work. They showed up that day at the firehouse prepared to do the job. They were of sound mind. They were fit. They were prepared. En route, everything was in place. All their training came to fruition in one day, where they had that opportunity to make that grab or that save or that rescue that would make a difference in somebody's life. What I didn't always have in my career, in my experience, was a company officer that would have the guts sometimes to grab his crew by the shoulders or the straps of the SCBA and say, back up, we're not going down this hallway. We're not doing this. And you have to have that. So in Texas, we call it the cowboy mentality, where, you're tough enough, nothing's going to scare you. You're going to bury up in that building, but we have to have an engaged brain in the entire process during the entire episode. So, and that has to set with the company officer. And I had people have asked me this question. So what happens if the company officer is your cowboy, bury up on every fire incident? And I raise a question that I think that's a concern for me at times.
Well, I'm okay if the company officer's a little cowboy, as long as the chief or the battalion chief there knows it, trains with them, recognizes it. Because I agree with you, I rather have to pull them out than push them in. It's definitely a lot easier, and I have a lot of respect for the Houston Fire Department. Their chief wrote for our book. I think it's I think it's a great fire department. I think they're leading in the right direction. If there's one culture thing I could say about Houston that I'd like to change, and I don't think it'd be talking out of school because it's pretty much known throughout the country. I was just teaching at FDIC, and I had a couple of Houston guys in my class. They tend to stand up, whether they can see their feet or not. So if there's one thing in Houston that I'd like to say, hey, if you don't have a camera, can we crawl? Can we please crawl? But when you were talking about putting together the class, that a lot of it is like old information in a sense, or information that we know. The problem is we know it, but we're still not doing it. It still comes down to that lack of leadership. You could take a class at, FDIC or some of these other great conferences like Providence, or the one that you teach at sometimes in Georgia, PJ. I mean, a lot of the information is the same, delivered with a little different flair, but we're not doing it. I love when a recruit or somebody in a class comes up and says, oh, a lot of that information was basic, because we're not doing it enough consistently. It comes down to those basics. It comes down to, and I love what you said, can you make the grab? Do we need to kill 6 people on a building that's going in the dumpster in the morning? Absolutely not. But should we just automatically take a defensive position when we arrive because it's vacant? Absolutely not. How did somebody get in the building? Is there a place where there's a door open? Can you shoot a camera in it? Can you go and do an isolated search and close the door? You can't just write off any structure at all. And, I've told this story so many times, but I love it. North Haven, Connecticut was a small, I don't know, what would you call it? A ranch, PJ? Small house where it was through the roof, and the officer ordered a 2.5 because they were going defensive. It was well through the roof, but the officer didn't slow down. He still moved with purpose, popped the front door and found a victim, and then shot with the camera and saw another victim in. So now they're going to risk a life, and they saved 2 viable victims in a small, I worked in a city. They're a small bedroom community right outside without proper staffing. And here they effected the rescue because they didn't get lulled into that safety complacency attitude of, hey, we're going to just do this. I think there's a valuable lesson for fire departments. If you're making the call that it's defensive, you still got to move with some purpose. And is there a place you can get to? But we want people to operate with a level of common sense. PJ?
Yes, I just want to backtrack a little bit because I said I was guessing at about 20 line of duty deaths. So when I actually counted them, so it was 16. And so just to make sure that my numbers are accurate. And Frank, and I agree. And Frank, that some of the public abuse that I've taken over the last 8 years or 9 years, focusing on a lot of the fire dynamics.
PJ's a pioneer, because I could say, and I don't mean to interrupt you, but I want to make this clear. When PJ talks about fire dynamics, I learned so much from him. I could go in a class right next to his, repeat what he says, but because I'm saying it, and I don't mean it like that, but because I'm saying it, they're like, yeah. And then PJ could say the same thing. And there was a time, and I think it's calmed down a lot, but they 100%. Were attacking you because, Daniel, I even put a slide up in my class of a fire department doing completely wrong. And I'm like, this isn't what PJ Norwood and Sean Gray are teaching. So just stop. I actually talk about it in my class because they took what they said and they just perverted it to be what they wanted it to be instead of based off reality. I'm sorry for interrupting you, PJ.
No, I appreciate that. And where I was going was that, getting back to, Chief, what you were saying is, I think that when we look at the current state of research-based tactics, there's a lot of firefighters across the country that automatically feel like, well, we're only going to be putting water up from the outside, or we're not going in the buildings. And in my classes, what I try to explain and communicate, and I'm getting better at it, is that the more that we understand from the research, the more aggressive we can be. The more we know about our environment, coupled with our experience, coupled with the knowledge of the building construction, we could go into some of those spaces that we may have previously said, we can't go in there. Because almost every building fire that we go to, there's space in that building that somebody can be currently survivable space. But I think that there's probably a lot of fires that I went to that said, let's write that off. This is defensive operation, because we didn't have the knowledge. And I like to encourage people that are potentially listening to that may still be standoffish to some of the research to understand that the research is there. It's making us smarter. So we could be more aggressive, if that's what you want to call it, to go places where we may not have been able to think that we could go before. And I'll couple that with our PPE and our technology today. We can go in places and make grabs that we may not have been able to go before. Frank, Chief?
Hey, first off, write down what you just said. Being smarter so we can be more aggressive. That will be a sold out class at FDIC. I'm being serious. You should take that title. You just said it and use it. That's a great title for a class. Daniel, what role in your investigations have you seen with radio transmissions? Do you use radio transmissions? Because I was doing an investigation once for the union, and just listening to the radio transmissions, it didn't work. You couldn't get I couldn't get a picture of the fire. I actually paid a court reporter to transcribe the radio transmissions, and then I found that you got to really sit with the court reporter after the report's done, just kind of like signing your deposition in a case, because some of the nomenclature gets lost on them and they'll be like, it was inaudible, but you'll be able to fill in some gaps. So can you speak a little bit to those radio transmissions?
Yes. As a matter of fact, in the Stan Wilson death, we did have to use a court stenographer to translate so we could actually see in writing what we were hearing. But unfortunately, with the Stan Wilson fire, Dallas at the time, and even to this very day, our fire ground communication takes place on a simplex radio channel, and our communication center cannot hear that. So all of the communication that was taking place on the fire ground, none of it was recorded or captured in the Dallas fire on May 20th of 2013. Even to the surprise of NIOSH, when they came in, they were asking for those audio tapes, and we didn't have them. All we had was the audio tapes of the actual dispatch to the incident, the initial companies given the size ups whenever multiple alarms were requested. But when the Mayday was transmitted and all of the communication on the fire ground scene, I didn't even have that to work with when we arrived. In Houston, they did have it. To this day, still Dallas, that was one of the recommendations that came out of Stan Wilson's death. Unfortunately, to this day, that we still haven't implemented accurately in the Dallas Fire Department, is to record that simplex radio channel on the fire ground. But when you go into the audio tapes and you start listening, you can at least put the timeline together so you know where you're working from an actual time, because nobody's sense of time at the incident is going to be accurate. I mean, some people will say 2 minutes and it was 20, and some will say it was 20 and it was 2. I mean, so the sense of time is clearly lost in the incident just because of the adrenaline and the emotions of the scenario, unfortunately. But as far as listening to what's contributing to the fire, I don't recall any of those being impactful in any of that. That the audio really gave us a clue that something clearly was about to happen. It really didn't play, at least in the ones that I've investigated, did not play a factor into that.
On the edited thing, I think that a lot of fire departments are reluctant to even give their training division tapes of the fires where nobody's killed. And I think that that's something that should change across the country. I'll give you an example. When somebody screams, an officer, take a lieutenant, who screams on the radio, what's the fire department's response to that? make fun of the individual, right? That is be sarcastic, make fun of that individual. I had somebody who had one of those speaker mics on the side of their thing, and they were always yelling, and people used to just make fun of them. And when I was able to grab the tape and sit the person down and say, listen to yourself, it actually made a tangible difference on every fire he went to since, because he actually got to hear himself. So I think there's a lot of value on the training side of radio communications, because PJ, I don't know, I think you might agree with me on this. I think when you look at the fire department, we do a lot of talking on the radio, but not a lot of communicating.
I would absolutely agree, 100%. You know, and listen, we've all been caught in that, right? I've listened to, you know, when I was a new officer, I would go, because I was friends with dispatch, being a small department, and I'd say, hey, pull all the audio for me. I want to listen to critique myself. And sometimes I'd sit back and go, why the hell did I even say that? What positive impact did that actually have? And usually the answer was none, right? Mm-hmm. So Frank, I agree with you. And I think that those recordings are key for self-reflection. If you're somebody who cares about your improvement, right, I would listen to them and say, okay, was my size up good? Were my updates good? Were my directions clear and concise? You know, because I can remember being in a small community, I'd come home sometimes and the scanner or the radio was always on. And my wife would say, hey, you kind of sounded a little out of breath on that job. Were you okay? Or your voice was elevated, so I was getting a little nervous. You know, my wife would listen and she would give me that critique. And if I said, well, I better go get the audio of this one and figure out how to do better. You know, so I do agree that those audios are really critical in helping, because we don't hear how we sound on the other side of the radio.
Well, and I would agree, having listened to a lot of audio, even non-LODD related. And I think that's a cultural issue that I think should have a little more focus for training. I can tell you from experience, sometimes the first two words out of the first two companies officers size up, you can tell whether or not they have a working fire just by the, like you said, the inflection of their voice or the fact that they've raised their voice a few octaves. And then you see so many companies, especially if they're first due, they want to give as brief of a size up as they possibly can, because they want to pass command and attack the fire immediately. And whereas if I hear a better, calm, concise, full report of what they're actually seeing, I think that helps set the tone for the rest of the incident as everybody else coming in. I mean, I don't know about y'all's experience, but my experience, the worse the scenario was, the calmer the incident commander had to be. I mean, I would even work at lowering my voice to the point where people couldn't hear me. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you start screaming, that's going to set a bad tone for everybody right off the bat. So, yeah, I think having those audios, because I know of a lot of people in my career, I've always laughed thinking, have you ever heard yourself on the radio? But the other part, by the way, you guys were talking about, because I do speak a lot to the point about culture, and you were using the word aggressive. And I think, PJ, you even did that. You might have to play the tape back. But when you used the word aggressive a few minutes ago, I think you even raised your voice for just a second. So that's one of those terms that I wrestle with in the fire department, because my assumption is we're all aggressive. I mean, we're in the firefighting business. We're not in the fire broker or fire sales or fire purchasing business. We're fighters. It's what we do for a living. We fight fire. I'm thinking that couldn't be any more aggressive.
You got to market your profession.
Yeah, but whenever you hear somebody say, I can't tell how many firehouses I've been to, because I travel a lot, I speak a lot, and people will tell me, you know, here at this organization, you know, we're aggressive firefighters. They raise their voice, and it's like they get angry when they say that word aggressive. And I almost always feel like, are you trying to sell me on something? I mean, you're a firefighter. I assume you're aggressive. You have to be aggressive. Firefighting is not a passive sport. It's an aggressive sport. So, but we have that mentality, and what I'm worried about is the firefighters that may not have the experience that we would all love to have, and they're focused on demonstrating that aggressive behavior. They want to be accepted as an aggressive firefighter because somewhere we have a metric system somehow or another puts a value on that. It's not the public. It's us. We self-impose it from our own culture. And I'm not suggesting for a second that that's bad. I want those people. That's who needs to be on the nozzle, enforcing entry and conducting searches. But are we trying to sell ourselves beyond our capabilities at times because we're trying to prove something? And that's the question I really want to make sure people who've been through my class are at least asking themselves. I'm not telling you which choice you need to make, but are you trying to sell yourself beyond our capabilities at times because we're trying to prove something? And that's the question I really want to make sure people who've been through my class are at least asking themselves. I'm not telling you which choice you need to make, but but it's got to be relevant. I mean, you have a family at the firehouse, you have a family somewhere else that cares about you. You have a community that doesn't want to see their firefighters die. I mean, a line of duty deaths is impactful to everybody. And most people don't expect us to die in their burning homes. Now, if we're trying to get to somebody else, yeah, but it's kind of like the words where people say, hey, firefighting's a dangerous business. You know, I always ask them, well, what day in your career did you finally learn that? Because I knew that before I started. And I'm thinking you guys did the same. So why are we saying that? When people tell me firefighting is a dangerous business, I ask them, why are you telling me that? Do you think I not know that? Or are you trying to justify your actions tomorrow?
Yep. So, and I'll answer from my perspective with what I was saying is because when we talk about the research-based tactics, we hear a lot of these, not a lot, we hear some firefighters say, the research and the science, we're going to be less aggressive because we're only going to be putting water from the outside and we're not going inside the building. So when I talk about fire dynamics and research-based tactics, I'm kind of talking to that group of firefighters who feel that we're going to create a less aggressive culture of fire service. So that's where my marrying that word is to that group. Well, I agree with you. So I think the smarter you are, the deeper you can go. Right? The farther you can go. You're going to be able to identify the places that you can go and the places that you can't go based on what the fire is telling you. Because as we know, fire is physics, right? The only thing difference is the building that it's in. It's going to react to the environment that it's in. So the more we understand the physics of the fire and the more we know the building construction, we can tell a lot of what's going to happen next.
I fully agree with that. But the other thing is, incident commanders, we've all stood out there before with our fingers crossed inside of our pocket with that clock running, and you're about to pull your crews out. Because no matter how much you know your buildings and how much you know your construction or your fire science, for me, the question always was remodeling or what they were storing in there. There's always the unknown of what that building's integrity actually is. And that's the fear factor we all have to live with. So once again, if you're being aggressive, you can't ever do that by compromising your smart. Ever. You can't.
Great.
In fact, the more aggressive you are, I think the smarter you have to be.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I love the word aggressive because I want that go-getter culture. Yeah. And like I said, I want the chief to be smart, that company officer and the firefighter to be smart, to be able to pull them back when needed. But I want, and here, I'll speak out of school here. New Haven had a line of duty death. And I'm a big believer, and PJ can vouch for this because I brought it as union president essentially to New Haven in a better way by bringing in PJ for PTSD and stress and all of that stuff. So I believe wholeheartedly in peer support. But the pendulum has kind of gone from where it was not used at all to where now people are using it as an excuse on the fire ground. You can use it as an excuse after the fire ground. You can bring in the dog, you can do hugs. I'm okay with everything. Therapy's great, but it can't be on the fire ground. New Haven had a line of duty death where the firefighter died. The lieutenant was unconscious at the time. A firefighter climbed the ladder who was supposed to be going in to rescue the firefighter and started crying on the ladder. And Matt Thomas, who's a hero on New Haven's rescue company, pushed him out of the way, jumped in the window, and saved the lieutenant. And even though the lieutenant was in the burn center for some time, Matt Thomas saved that firefighter's life because he was being aggressive. So I want to make sure we take care of mental health and that we take care of the culture, but there's a time and place for it, and it can't be on the fire ground when our own members or the public is there. And when I first joined the fire service, aggressive wasn't a dirty word. It wasn't acting reckless. It was, if you want to be a member of aggressive company, you got to make sure your tools are clean. You got to do your housework. You got to be smart about size up. You got to learn everything about, as Tommy Brennan said, our past editor, learn everything about a job that could kill you. So that's where I take it. And I think that some people co-opted the word to try to make it mean something else as reckless. So, and as Orwell said, if you can control language, you can control thought. And I hate when individuals try to control language, but I think all sides need to be heard, and we need to have this cogent debate, because a lot of times everybody puts a different meaning to the same word. So clarifying it, I think goes a long way. And I think you said it. If the grab can be made, you need to make the grab. So I stand with you 100%. And I know that Steve Marzars, who's did a great paper on survivability profile, he can't stand the word. And he's complaining to me one day, and he goes, a New York City guy, he goes, all these guys who put aggressive in their class names, they're getting twice the attendance. And I said, yeah. I go, Steve, mine's aggressive search, and I got twice the attendance of yours. So who's making the mistake here? You got to bring him into church. You got to give him a reason to believe, because we do have that shared purpose. And I know what you were saying, but I just want to make sure that some people don't take what you were saying the wrong way. Always market your fire service. As a union president, I hated when my firefighters would say, "Oh, we didn't do anything last night. We had food on the stove." No, people don't care if you cut a hole in their roof and made a strong push. They care that you put out that stove fire and save their belongings. So you should say, "Hey, we made a great stop last night, and we really made an impact on the community." And my other biggest pet peeve: firefighters think they work for the FBI and they can't talk to anybody on scene. And here I got two experts in the fire service and a fire marshal from the city of Dallas, which is very impressive. You might be our first fire marshal here. There's only really two things that you can't say to the public, right? You can't say anything about cause and origin, and you can't give out any medical information. Besides that, you can be warm, friendly, and talk to the people because they want to talk to you. And I see so many firefighters being stoic and like walking by the public. And it's like, do you realize that affects your budget, affects your staffing, which has a direct impact on potential line of duty or saving property? Do you want to weigh in on that after I went on that big tangent? Go ahead, Daniel. Sorry.
Well, to what you were saying at the end there about, selling ourselves to the public, one of the things I see with a lot of my travels that just astonishes me is the staffing levels across the country. I mean, when it comes to those split second, can we get in there and get them or not? I was blessed to work for an organization that had a minimum staffing of 4 on every engine and every truck. But I see other departments that I spoke for a department just recently that has 2 on all of their engines. And I just don't comprehend it. Now, they make it work. And I think that's probably to their detriment. But the reality is you can't pull off what we can pull off with a 4-member crew. You just can't do that. And I don't know why there's not more standardization across the country. I don't know why NFPA puts a big emphasis on our response times, but I don't see the staffing models and the staffing comparisons of what we can actually do. Even in a CPR, I mean, if you're working a medical emergency, that extra 3rd person and 4th person on the crew is a huge help, to drive the ambulance to the hospital, to get the patient down from the 3rd floor of the apartments on a stretcher. I mean, that's where what we do is very labor intensive. And I just don't understand how that's not sold more. So to your point, yeah, I think the fire service does a terrible job of selling ourselves to the public. I know years ago in Dallas, we had about 15 years ago, they were wanting to close 17 firehouses. I probably shouldn't even be saying that here on a show, but that was the case. They were trying to close 17 firehouses because the budget was in such dire straits. And the chief at the time had to wrestle with, do we reduce our staffing to 3 or do we brown out firehouses? And he had asked me my opinion, and I was very passionate about close the firehouses. Because the citizens will demand at some point that they get reopened and we'll have them back. But nobody counts heads on a fire truck. Nobody does. The public does not.
I absolutely agree with you. I actually think what you're saying is smart, because we saw New Britain, Connecticut was a real aggressive, really good department. They're still a good department, but they're not as good as they were when they had 4 people on a piece. They would have been better off going down a piece. Springfield, Massachusetts, same thing. Really good department, had a strong reputation. That reputation isn't as strong down with 3. And, I always say there's no politician on scene that is telling you can't call for the resources you need when you're in command, have some aggressive radio as an officer and call for the help you need. Everybody wants to come to your fire. So I agree with you. That's actually wisdom, because so many people would in this country want to drop staffing and not companies. I maintain that 4. If you got that 4, maintain that 4, because it makes such a big difference. I think that's wisdom there that you're speaking, Daniel. PJ?
Yeah, and I would agree. And Chief, you don't realize, but Frank worked in the city of New Haven, running 4 members on a company. I worked in East Haven, a small suburban community that bordered the city, with 2 per piece. On the city line, we had 2.5 and 3 woods. Right, this one's in New Haven. They would get an initial response of what, Frank, 20 or so on your first alarm assignment?
Probably 25, 26 now.
Right, with 4 on a piece. My department would go to this house right next door, right? Probably built in the same week in the 30s and 40s and 50s, and we would get 12 maximum coming from all over the town with only 2 per piece. So we couldn't agree more. And Frank and I have talked about that at length in the past. But we're getting down to got about 10 minutes or so left, and I have a crazy theory. That's all that it is just a theory that's unsubstantiated. I just kind of wanted to get your opinion on it.
All right.
So the line of duty deaths in your area in Texas, were the majority of those commanded by an incident commander who is in a car or standing on the front lawn?
So in Dallas, our command is mobile.
Mobile. Okay, so we'll stick with just Dallas then, right?
Right.
And that's how that's the environment Frank and I come from, right? Mobile. I don't think I could ever command from sitting in a vehicle. Right? Just not how I was raised, not how I was brought up, not how I've worked. But there's something that I've seen in some line of duty death reports of this rapid fire involvement, right? Where the things occur and this rapid fire involvement terminology is used in the line of duty death report. And I feel that doesn't happen as often in the departments where they're commanding from a vehicle. Because I know commanding from the front lawn, there's a lot of distractions, right? Just a lot of distractions. You're talking to this company, you're looking at the building, you're looking down the street, you may have the occupants screaming or yelling, right? There's a lot of distractions when you're on the front lawn versus when you're in a car, which again, I don't think I could do, but sitting in a car with the windows rolled up, the distractions are controlled. So I'm thinking, just theory, that the incident commanders commanding from a vehicle will have less line of duty death reports from rapid fire involvement because there's less distractions. And I keep saying this in hopes that someday somebody like you or somebody else will say, hey, I know somebody who can actually dive into the data and figure out if there's something behind that or not.
So I'm aware of some near line of duty deaths, or at least maydays, where the actual mayday wasn't heard on the fire scene because of the distractions that you're talking about. Whereas in other situations, they were clearly able to hear that in the car, where you are clearly not distracted. You're in control of that. My personal opinion is, I think both of them work. I think both are clearly workable, because the departments that do the command post isolated and they're in the car, I have not seen anything that raises a concern about that. Okay. Now, if you did that in Dallas to us tomorrow, that would be a challenge, because that's not what we're comfortable with, and vice versa. So I'll share this with you. We had a fire chief that came to Dallas a couple of years ago, and he had just come from a department where they did the stationary command, where they operated from inside the vehicle. And he was concerned that we didn't do it that way in Dallas. And at the time, we had 2 battalion chiefs. And I know you think I'm making this up, but these 2 guys, one of them still on the job, but between the 2 of them, they had more than 100 years in the fire department in Dallas. As a matter of fact, between the 2 of them, they had more than 50 years as battalion chiefs. Very, very seasoned. One of them is still there. He's still working.
Great.
And he had a serious conversation with this new chief. And the new chief said, I would like to look at us migrating into doing a stationary command where we're not mobile at the scene. And he was basing it off of a lot of the line of duty deaths reports that he had read. And this particular chief raised a question to him. He said, in my 25 years as a battalion chief, do you have any idea how many times when I could walk to the back of the building, or I could walk at least down the side, if I could get a 360, that's great. If I could at least get a 180, that was great. And I would see something that the first engine company and truck company that buried up in that house didn't see. And I was able to tell them, get out now or back out. And he said, I would never have seen that in an isolated command post with the windows rolled up and me not having a good view of the building. And he kind of sold this new chief that, it's been working for Dallas. So I have not seen myself personally, I have not investigated a line of duty death fire where I think if the command had been mobile versus stationary, it would have changed the incident.
Okay.
I'm not saying that there isn't one out there and that there couldn't be one out there. Me personally, with all of the LODDs I've been involved in, I have not seen that as a factor. And one of the other, if you think about one of the biggest factors for a line of duty deaths is a failure to do a 360. So the question always is, then who's doing a 360 if the incident commander is stationary in the vehicle and then not moving from the vehicle? Where are their eyes if everybody's buried up and losing situational awareness? Who has their back from that farther altitude?
And in the department that I come from, it wouldn't work because the staffing is so poor. Mm-hmm. You could never achieve the assessment, the 360, establishing the divisions. We just don't have that staff, so it would have to be a larger department that has that robust command staff that can fill all of those positions in that first 3 to 4 minutes before we get to that 7 and 9 minute mark that you were discussing at the beginning of the call, Frank.
Yeah, in New Haven, because of the way our buildings are laid out, you're not going to do it. The first 2 officers not going to do 360. You'd have to break down a fence, fake out a dog. You might even get mugged. It's just not going to happen. We would have our RIT team by policy responsible for do the 360, and then later arriving command officers when there's divisions. And then, as always, the first key report is from the roof, who's generally on a flat roof is generally going to get a look at the rear when they walk the rim. On the inside, whether you do inside or outside, in my book, the chapter in command presence was contributed by Dave Polikoff and Anthony Castros, who command inside a vehicle, and myself and Anthony Avillo wrote the outside portion of it. I think there's equal value in both. I think the most hazard is in the outside, because I think there's 2 things that we really need to do a better job with. We need a little bit more command discipline, that even if they're the one that does the 360 or the 180, that they have to stay at the command post. It's like there should almost be like a dog leash on it that lets them go 10 feet, because in New England, we quite often find the command post abandoned, and that's bad. The other problem that I see, that I really like the car thing, is I think that when you're commanding from in a car, and no, I wouldn't want to do it this way, but I think the command officers ask better questions to get a better picture of what's going on. And the command officers outside, because they're seeing everything, a lot of it is internalized. So one thing, if you're a command officer that's in front of the building, one thing I recommend, face-to-face is always best. But if you do a face-to-face interaction where it's going to have an impact on another company operating, even though it was face-to-face, as the command officer, you need to transmit that really quick over the radio. Give you a quick example. Engine 15 comes up to the command post. I just stretched short. Okay. Now the chief knows it. He's going to mitigate it. But now you have a truck company searching without a line. That should be radioed immediately. Engine 15 stretched short. There's going to be a slight delay getting another line in the second floor. Just something that quick. A mistake I made on the last fire that they sent the Mayday for me was I was given the basement division in a face-to-face. I didn't realize it was a problem until the investigation, because when I got a letter from a lieutenant that was on writ, they thought I was the safety officer, where when I got that division as basement, I should have put over the radio because the chief didn't do it. Car 81 is basement division, rescue 1 and so are reporting to me. So I think we need to do just a little bit better job on the radio transmissions, short, concise, and clear, to paint that fire ground. And I think they do a better job of that in the car. And get that dog leash. If after your 360, you have to be where if somebody goes to the command post, they can find you. Daniel?
I think one of the things I probably failed to tell you, and this is probably going to irate some folks whose staffing is a struggle. In Dallas, we send 2 battalion chiefs on any structure fire, but on a high-rise box, we send 4 and a deputy chief. And every one of those chief officers has a command tech, a chauffeur, somebody who's driving them. They're a / administrative aide. So there is always 2 people, even on one battalion chief's car. So in a typical one alarm fire in Dallas, you end up with 2 command techs at the command post who's running everything. And then one chief is the Charlie chief and one is the Alpha chief, who's the incident commander. So you have eyes on both sides of the building, but there's somebody at that command post. Having been a deputy chief, when I would arrive at a multiple alarm fire, I would have 4 command technicians plus my own command technician to oversee at the command post, as well as the chief officer. So the staffing was there. So it was easy for me to be able to step back and have somebody run interference on any of the distractions that would take my eye off the ball, if you would, during the incident.
That's awesome.
And that's awesome. That's great command staff. And by talking, you can tell that you use that staff appropriately, which is key. So, Chief, we always try to be very respectful of the 1 hour mark, because we have a lot of, firefighters that try to listen, on their way to work, their way home from work, or on shift. So we really try to cut these calls to an hour, these podcasts. But I know that I think that we could probably sit here and talk for, 3 hours on this topic, because I don't think we can ever discuss line of duty deaths enough to learn from, to honor those that we are lost, and to not repeat history. But if you take a couple minutes to kind of close us out, talk about your class and what you teach on top of these, and then Frank will say goodbye and close out the night for all of us.
Okay, without being too wordy, we also discussed the complacency factor. We discussed the normalization of deviance, which has been used a lot in our industry. But I try to take it down to the level of the student or the person that's in the class on how that applies to their life on a daily basis, especially with confirmation bias and all the terms and all the technology that we have out there. People are picking and choosing. We talked about the word aggressive. The other words that I absolutely just hate hearing is risk versus reward. I mean, because we throw those words around like it means something to everybody, but every one of us has a different definition of what risk is and a different definition of what reward is. And the reality is it only matters to the person who's making that call at that time on the fire scene. So I like to make sure that we're adding that smart to everybody's decision and trying to realize, our job is to go home safe. I mean, nobody is supposed to show up at the fire and get hurt or killed. That's not the plan. And we can clearly understand this is a dangerous business. It's dangerous for us all to drive to the firehouse just to go to work. I mean, we know there's an inherent risk in everything that we do, but we should be trying to mitigate that as best we can. And a lot of that goes back down to the culture that we work in. Where is our focus? Is our focus on being better every day? Are we really, really prepared for that once in a lifetime possible scenario where you have to make the decision to push yourself a little farther down that hallway to make a grab or to get those kids out of that house because they're in a survivable space? I mean, that's hard to do in a serious training scenario. So everything from psychology to mental fitness to physical fitness to your skill set of being prepared every single time you go out that door on that run. And are you ready for that moment? So I talk about that in my class. I think that's, to me, impactful for me in my career. At least it was.
See, PJ, and I thought he was just the guy with nice hair. He's got everything here. Honor to have you on the show. You'll be welcome back anytime. Looking forward to, you're going to get my yes if I get your evaluation, you're going to get my yes for FDIC. And we're looking for new instructors at FDIC. So the board meeting is going to be asking for individuals that we think that should take that next step. And, you belong there. You deserve to be there. So I'll be giving you my recommendation. And I just got one question that I want to leave off the night with is the Trump trial. Is he going to be acquitted, convicted, or a hung jury? I'm going to say it's a hung jury. PJ?
Acquitted.
Wow. From Texas. Don't let me down.
Hung.
What? Hung?
Hung.
Okay. That's interesting. That's it.
And I would not put your money on me in anything. And don't follow me. If I bet A, go with B. You'll win.
That's it for Politics and Tactics tonight. It's an honor to be on with PJ Norwood. As always, thank you to Mark Ha for producing the show and making it happen. We really appreciate it. And Daniel DeYear, we look forward to seeing you at FDIC, and we're going to do what we can. And the best thing about FDIC is everybody that puts in an application to teach, even myself and PJ, gets peer reviewed. So there's been years where I didn't get a class or didn't get this class and got that class. But the first year I put in for FDIC, I didn't get in. So always put in, start writing, call people that are having these shows and say, hey, you got a message and you want to be on one of these shows. We'd love to hear from you. And that's it for Politics and Tactics tonight.
Thanks, Chief.